Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. For this Forgotten Friday, we're going to be doing a build video rather than an unboxing in the form of not one, but two Revell 1/72 scale F4U-4 Corsairs. I've previously done an inbox review having a look at this kit, so if you want to see what's inside the box, go check that one out. But for this build series, we'll be taking these two kits and making them as Tom Hudner and Jesse Brown's aircraft from VF32. And in part 1, we'll be covering assembly, including adding a 3D printed cockpit, and showing how I correct some of the more noticeable mistakes in this kit. So without further ado, let's get into it. To begin with, I washed all of these sprues in some warm soapy water, along with the resin cockpit I'd designed and 3D printed, which had previously been washed in alcohol and cured off screen. I cut out the fuselage from the sprues and set those aside, as the cockpit in this build would entirely be made from my resin parts. These needed to be cut off their supports from printing, which I did using my side cutters. My cockpit design consisted of a floor along with a rear bulkhead, main instrument panel, two sidewalls, and some smaller parts for some extra detail. The kit's original plastic guidelines for its cockpit had to be removed using a knife and file, and once I'd sanded the edges of the resin rear bulkhead down, I glued it with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to the cockpit floor. I had to trim a tiny bit off the rear edges of the floor to make a perfect fit, and once that was done, I then used some blue tack to stick the other cockpit parts to a cocktail stick for painting. Normally for models, I would prime the interior first, but for this build, I decided to try skipping this step to save a bit of time, and instead mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 5 drops of Vallejo Model Air 71010 US Interior Green. While this paint sprayed on pretty well onto the plastic parts, it didn't stick so well to the resin ones, and despite trying to build it up slowly in layers, I ended up applying it too thick and found that it pooled in some areas, which I'd have to later touch up. There was also a lot less depth since I was only spraying onto white plastic, so I'll definitely keep using my gloss black primer on cockpits in future builds. For the detail work, I decided to try using a lighter colour than straight black in the form of AK Interactive 7021 Dunkel Grau. This acrylic paint was carefully thinned with a bit of water and brush painted onto the panels, joystick grip, and the raised details which would have been black on the actual aircraft. I used a brush and the interior green to touch up some of the resin parts where the interior green hadn't stuck, though in some spots I had to apply a few coats as the airbrush layer seemed to peel away in a few spots since it didn't stick very well to the resin. For the instrument dials and fuse switches, I used Vallejo Model Color Flat Black so they would stand out from the dark grey panels. This was followed by some more detailed painting using Vallejo Vermilion Red, Vallejo Flat Yellow, and Vallejo Flat White, which was also dry brushed onto some of the cockpit surface details to highlight them, and to pick out the raised details I'd designed into the gauges. Further details were then painted with some Model Air RLM01 silver, such as the switches and the gun sight, and then I painted the joystick cover, the oxygen control valve on the floor with flat black, and the headrest with Dunkel Grau. I removed the parts from the cocktail stick and did a quick test fit of the cockpit, and when I was satisfied everything fitted perfect as designed, I used some Vallejo gloss varnish to dab onto the gauges to give them a behind glass effect, did some final dry brushing with the white on the sidewalls, and then glued the sidewalls to the cockpit floor with the Deluxe Materials Odorless CA glue, followed by the instrument panel. With everything in place, I did a test fit of the cockpit parts and the fuselage, and found that everything fitted pretty decently. Some additional resin details for the oxygen and canopy handle were glued to the sidewalls, and then they received a coat of the interior green. Once dried, flat black was then used to pick out the details, along with some vermilion red, and for the oxygen lines a bit of olive grey. I did some final touch-ups in the cockpit, followed by some dry brushing of the headrest with some Vallejo flat white, and then I added some metal chipping onto the seat and cockpit floor using Vallejo Model Air aluminium. I used a dry brushing technique to build it up carefully, though I would probably next time do this before assembling the cockpit to make it a bit easier to add some scratches on the floor. Some Tamiya enamel black panel scent was then applied over all of the interior parts to highlight their details, and once it had been applied, I then used a brush dipped in some enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner and help it flow mainly into the recessed details to give them a dirty, grimy appearance in places, as well as to help show off the recessed details. The cockpits were then glued to the right fuselage halves, and after taking some photos, I then glued the two fuselage halves together using Revell Contactor Professional on the plastic parts, and some of the Rocket Odorless CA glue on the resin ones. To my delight, these parts all fitted very well. Some Tamiya masking tape was wrapped tightly around the fuselage halves to hold them together while they bonded, and then I ran some Tamiya extra thin cement along the seam lines to help fill them in and strengthen the bond between these parts. I set them aside to dry, and in the meantime cut out the wings along with the horizontal stabilizers and tail parts, and began to clean these parts up of any flash and excess sprue. The top wing halves were then glued to the lower wing halves, clamped into place with some bulldog clips, and once again I ran some Tamiya extra thin into the seams between these parts. The radiator pieces were then glued into place, and they fitted okay, but there was a subtle gap. The engine cowling, 2 rows of cylinders, gearbox and propeller parts were the next to be removed from the sprue, and I found that the cylinders were a particular pain as the sprue attachments were very thick and close to the cylinder heads, making them very hard to remove. The top fuselage part also was cut out and had its glare shield removed so that it would fit with the new 3D printed part. As you'll see later on, this part is actually the wrong shape for a later model Corsair and appears to be a part recycled from the Revell -1 kit. Initially, I glued the engine cowling parts together, but after assembling the engine and gearbox and trying to get them to fit inside, I found I would have to pull apart the cowling to make them fit during assembly, so in the meantime I took the cowling apart except for the front and top part of it, and glued the engine parts and exhausts to the bulkhead, which had the cow flaps moulded shut. The fuselage and wings had had a few hours to bond by now, so I removed all of the clamps and masking tape and glued them together. The fit was pretty good for the wings and fuselage, so I then added the rudder and horizontal stabilizers. I ran some Tamiya extra thin along some of the gaps before then adding the wingtip parts to the wings, and I found that these parts didn't fit so well, which was pretty annoying, especially on the underside. Ironically, this Corsair is the only one I've seen in 1/72nd scale so far that doesn't have a foothole in the flap, which is accurate for the early versions of the Corsair, but all later ones would have had it. I ended up borrowing the Tamiya Corsair's flap and used it as a template to mark out the footsteps with a needle, and then I cut away the footwell, sanded the edges, and while doing this also removed the early antenna point on the top of the tail. I then made the edge of the footwell by gluing a very small piece of plastic into place to make the edge of the flap, and although this was a little bit crude, I thought I did a pretty good job adding the footwells without too much fuss. Further improvements included chopping the exhausts, not for noise, but rather making them a more accurate size, and I did attempt to scribe the footwells on the fuselage side, but didn't really have a good template, so I ended up later filling over my attempts with putty and sanding them smooth. The upper fuselage part was then added to the Corsairs, but I found on one of them that a lot of pressure was needed at the front of the fuselage halves to get a tight fit. Learning from my experience with the cockpit, I decided to prime the engine and cowling parts before painting them this time, so I used my typical choice of Vallejo Gloss Plaque Primer, thinned down with some acrylic flow improver. Once this was applied, I let the primer cure for a couple of hours, and returned to the fuselage, doing a lot of sanding along the seam lines to start to soften them up. Initially, I used a metal file for the sanding, and then gradually transitioned to a softer nail file, and would later do more filling with a bit of putty. The canopies included in this kit were a little bit mediocre, so I decided to turn one of them into a mould by filling it with milliput and vacuforming my own set. My first attempts were a bit rough, especially around the edges, since I didn't have them outlined very precisely, and they didn't fit very well as a result. But I did learn from my Italeri Mustang build and procure myself a smaller pair of scissors, which made it a lot easier to cut them out. I would later on redo the canopies and get a much better result. I decided though to keep the first attempt at a front windshield in place and use it as a template to help me fill in the incorrect gap in the front fuselage part with some Vallejo water-based putty. The putty was also applied over any large gaps in all of the seam lines quite heavily, and once it had been added, I then wiped away most of the excess with a damp finger so that it would build up in only the larger gaps. By now the engine parts were ready for some painting, so I mixed up 4 parts Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 4 drops of Vallejo Model A US Navy Glossy Sea Blue and painted the inside of the engine cowlings. I then used a similar ratio of flow improver to paint with some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium Silver to paint the engines. Since acrylic paints dry very quickly, by the time I'd cleaned up my airbrush, I could then paint the gearbox on the engine with some ocean grey, the rear of the engine bulkhead and a few touch-ups on the cowling with some USN Gloss Sea Blue, and finally I picked out some of the wiring and engine details with some model colour flat black. A second coat of these colours was applied, and then I finally glued the engine to the top part of the cowling and added the lower part. These parts didn't fit too well though, and required a lot of force to then fit to the fuselage, which unfortunately caused me to break one of the propeller attachment points on one of the Corsairs. Tamiya Extra Thin was applied, followed by a fair bit of Vallejo water-based putty to then try and fill in the gaps around these engine parts. I let all of the putty dry for around about 12 hours, and then using some 2000 grit sandpaper, I sanded away any remaining putty and seam lines until I had a smooth finish and the gaps were largely gone. I probably should have applied some putty around the wing areas and especially the radiators, but on the whole I was pretty happy with the sanding and filling, given that it's an area I've been wanting to improve with my kit building, and these were pretty gappy kits. The landing gear parts and drop tanks were then cut out and sanded of their various imperfections, and the landing gear doors had to be cut in half to be in the open position, which is very fiddly to do, and I broke several of the fine hinge points which come moulded to these parts. The front part of the wings with the 350 cal machine guns were then glued to each wing, and then I attached the pylons for the fuel tank or bombs and the tail wheel. The main landing gear was very fiddly and annoying to assemble, and some of the parts are fragile and very easy to break off from the way they're attached to the sprue, but once I figured out one of them, the rest of the landing gear and its various doors were reasonably easy to assemble, though the tail wheel doors were especially awkward to add. The final part I added to the landing gear was the main wheels, which were glued to the struts, and then I left the aircraft aside to dry as the landing gear was very fragile. While I let the gear harden, I assembled the fuel tanks, which had some rather large gaps, and one set of bombs, as unfortunately the second Corsairs were missing part of the stabilising fin. By now I was pretty much ready to prime the aircraft, so the last thing I did was repair some of the panel lines which had been lost during sanding by using some SMS clear scribing tape and my Tamiya scribing tool to rescore them. I originally planned to paint the fuel tanks at the same time, but they required a fair bit of filling, so I decided to fill them with putty and leave them aside to deal with later. To prepare the Corsairs for priming, I then wiped off any dirt and grease using a microfiber cloth, and after filling the engine and cockpit over with blue tack to mask them off and attaching the propeller to a cocktail stick, I mixed up 20 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 18 drops of Vallejo gloss black primer, and began to spray this on the underside of the first Corsair, building it up gradually in layers until eventually the whole underside was a reasonably uniform gloss black finish. I then sat the first Corsair aside while the primer became touch dry, and repeated this process on the second Corsair, and then primed the propellers. Once again, I then repeated this step on the second Corsair, and then set them both aside for at least 12 hours to let the primer cure before painting, which is what we'll be doing in part 2. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and if you have any suggestions on how I can improve or any kits you want to see me build in the future, be sure to leave it down in the comments below. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons who helped me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I've used to make them, and the time I spend creating these designs, as well as 3D printing them and making the videos. If you want to help fund my channel while getting a few little perks, I'll leave links to my Patreon down below. Next time we'll be covering painting these aircraft, as well as adding some custom decals I had printed, so I'm looking forward to sharing how that went. Otherwise though, until the next video, as always, take care, thanks for watching, and model on.